All right, welcome to the hyper63 Technical Steering Committee meeting. It's March 16th. Everyone needs to remember to wear green tomorrow or you'll be in risk of social distancing fouls. It is St. Patty's Day, and after this I have to build a leprechaun trap. Daughter's gonna catch a leprechaun. Anyway, thanks for joining. The main thing I have on the agenda today is to talk through the RFC 008, but also open to talk through other things. One announcement is the Open Source 101 conference on March 30th. It's free, and definitely recommend, if you can, to sign up on that. I think there will be some good talks, but it's virtual like everything, so you know, but I think the talks will be good. I'm really looking forward to Jeff Atwood, who maintained or used to maintain Stack Overflow and had the blog Coding Horror. Okay, sorry if I locked up.
I saw Henry Zhu is
Yeah,
speaking as well.
yeah, he's the maintainer of Babel, and yeah, Ben is well known in the React community. I think there's some good speakers there. Definitely something worth picking up. Um, cool, and big shout out to Tyler and Trip for really asking some tough questions on this RFC. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into that. And then I know Casey's going to, is working on a auth service, and he may have some questions or comments. Also, I did have a lot of bug fixes with the cache service, and so it is working really well now. And there was just some simple little things, but it's actually working on one of the projects that I'm working on, which is pretty cool. It's doing pretty good, and a lot of tweaks to search, and and that should be working pretty well too. Of course, data's working good, but the upcoming service that's kind of being requested or is requested is a queue service. And what I'll do is I'll just share my screen with the RFC.
So just out of curiosity, Tom, what adapter are you using for cache on this project?
Redis, the Redis adapter. Yeah. But
And are you
yep.
using the Elasticsearch adapter for search or something else?
No, I was using the Elasticsearch adapter for search and mini search, but both of those are up, and then also using Kendra, but it's not an adapter yet. so I'm using Kendra on a project, but it's not an adapter. But Elasticsearch is working well.
Okay. If there's any bugs with that one, feel free to. I see one in the issues. Feel free to tag me in those, and I can take a look at them and see
Cool.
if I can't bang them out.
Yep. Sounds good. Yeah, I think the one thing, if memory serves me, is the filter, being able to filter on attributes with Elasticsearch, and I think that bug's filed, but I'll tag you on it.
Yeah, I see it. Sorry, I didn't see it before.
No, that's all right.
Let me take a look at it.
Okay, so again, thanks Trip and Tyler for taking a look at this on Friday. Just some background on the queue service. The queue service is um, kind of focused at this point, but basically one of the projects that I've been working on, we're building the API in a serverless environment using Vercel. And part of the API is to run through a rules engine and then return some results back from that rules engine, um, that are matches, right? They're matches for the submitter to review. Then at kind of in a synchronous point of view, there's a hooks interface where all of the um, entities or partners that have been matched need to get notified via some kind of webhook to um, like Salesforce or something like that. So it kind of generates a lead, um, or a message to them. And so the the API that sits in front of Hyper has this hooks interface on serverless, which was working great, except for serverless. Once you return your response back to the client, it kills the process. So you can't run anything after that. And that's where this challenge kind of came about, is the fact that um, that there may be, at least five kind of hooks set, 5 to 6 kind of hooks set. When this rules engine processes and returns a result, it needs to put a message somewhere that then gets invoked, and actually 5 messages, if you will, that get invoked at a later time, um, so that the request can not be a long running request. When the rules engine runs, it returns back, and then those 5 or 6 requests can happen in a background kind of process. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that?
Yeah, I think I understand the use case. Makes sense.
Cool. So, so I kind of just put up there based on some of the feedback that, we're not trying to be the, push, pull, pub sub, end all be all kind of queue service, really focused on kind of a worker queue service, or some people call it a push queue service. But one of the things is that we want to use Hyper to abstract all the complexity away. So it's they don't have to manage servers. They don't have to think about Redis and think about, you know, I need to install workers and manage that, etc. They really just have a REST interface. And then the other side is for right now, it's mainly focused around short task, like sub 3 minutes, not long running task. And then the last thing is it's not a scheduling service. So it's really just focused on, you know, handling kind of these background fetch or API calls, if you will. And then I kind of broke down some background, what is a queue? Feel free to edit any of that kind of stuff. What's a task or a job? And basically, I kind of use task and job interchangeably, but basically, it's a document that contains instructions for some process to use to do something. Could be send an email, send a text, could be to make a um, web service call, etc. It's just um, a JSON document, and then kind of go in and explain what is a work or task queue, and basically the best way I can explain it is in any queue process you have kind of a producer, a broker, and a consumer. The producer creates the job, which pushes it on a queue, and there could be one to many consumers, but the broker will only assign one job um, to a consumer, and then that consumer will tell the broker when it's done, and then it can receive another job. So there will never be like that one consumer receiving multiple jobs concurrently, but you could have 10 consumers running, and then the broker could take 10 jobs and submit those to those 10 consumers if they were all available. Does that make sense?
Very much like SQS.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yep. Yeah. Just super simple. There is some built-in semantics, like if for whatever reason the job or task times out, then there would be a set amount of retries. So it would retry, let's say 5 times. And if on the fifth time it doesn't, it would go into what's, kind of called a dead letter queue. But it would be basically going into a queue that says, okay, someone needs to come in and do something about this. So far, so good. Um, so I'm going to skip down to the diagram because that's really an easier thing to talk about. But basically, the kind of minimum viable commands for this is one, a create queue command, which I'm trying to follow the same pattern of all the services, and I had a thought um, to do an experiment, but I really think that I can take that pattern and actually abstract a lot of the commands um, in the core module and the Express app module, and whittle those down because they really are doing the same thing, except one is a data service, one is a queue service, one is a cache service. So um, let me see. I can. Well, if you think of Express and how you can create path parameters, you have this path parameter name. I think I can create a service path parameter. Oops, and a an ID path parameter or an action path parameter, and get a lot of reusability from there. Um, but anyway, um, the the gist of this service is we're doing a put to create a queue, and we give it a name, and then the one thing that we need to do is send a payload. So when we do this put, and let's say we name the queue hooks or whatever, um, we're going to send a payload, and there'll be two properties on there. One is a worker, and that's kind of the target of the consumer. So when a job gets posted, there will be a worker running inside hyper63, and that worker will um, use this URL to send the job to the outside world. And then the secret, and this secret could be optional, but basically what it would do is create a JSON web token using that secret, so that when the um, recipient of this job, they can verify the token to make sure that this job actually came from hyper63. So, and I think Trip asked a really good question: is the secret going to be logged or stored on a database? And the answer is no, it won't be logged, but yes, it'll be stored in a database. Kind of using the same standards that you would store a password. I forget the name. It's like PBGK encryption or whatever. Two. I forget. I think I've got it down here in a note somewhere. Well, I can't find it. But basically, it's going to use an encrypted field that matches the current standards of encryption for a password. Um, so when the queue is created, that's kind of a one-time thing, and it's also item potent. So what that means is the client can call it many times, and as long as it's the exact same name, it's just going to return okay. It's just going to return okay. It's like, even if you already created it, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to return okay. Um, and that'll just uh, allow the client to create an initialization event. So every time they deploy, they can just reinitialize the service, and it's all good. Um, Then the second command is post job. So the client will post to the queue, and in that post job, they're going to send their data. So there's no really at this point required attributes there. All of the required attributes like a job ID and all of those kinds of things will be kind of behind the scenes, just because each kind of queue service could have different semantics, and we want to abstract those away from the client. They should just post the data that they want to work on, and then we can deal with the rest of the documents that's required, whether it's RabbitMQ or Sidekick or Celery or BQ. We can deal with those in the adapter level. Does that make sense?
Uh, so, quick question:
Yeah.
as far as like the system of record for the jobs, like the queue, is the idea here to just like build adapters around, like, let's say like SQS? That's like a common one, to where like hyper63 is hyper63 meant to be the system of record for the pending jobs, or it's just purely just an abstraction over something like SQS that
Uh,
has its own system of record?
yeah. I think each adapter would be able to make that decision, right? So, um, For example, the BQ adapter, the system of record would be Redis, and the queue service kind of sits on top of Redis. And then hyper63 is just really just keeping the abstraction simple, and also running a worker or one or more workers, right, in the background. So um, and I'll try to explain that a little bit more. But then with SQS, it's kind of the same thing. SQS would be the system of record, but Hyper63 would also, it's kind of running this API, right? It's providing this API, but with the queue service, it will also have to launch a set of processes that are essentially workers that are listening to the queue. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think I'm following mostly.
Yeah. That's, so, so,
There's like
so
a set of workers that aren't actually performing the jobs, like the processing. They're just performing the listening of the
exactly,
jobs.
exactly. They're proxy workers, right? That they listen within the boundary of Hyper63, so that the client doesn't have to have direct exposure to the queue itself. Those workers kind of listen within the boundary, and all they do is when a job appears on the queue, they just dispatch that job. So that worker will call the worker URL, generate the token, and send the data literally back to the API or wherever the API told them that those jobs go. And and then it'll be up to that API or that target. They have essentially 3 minutes to do their work, and then they need to respond back with either a 200 or whatever the success code is, or an error code, or they will get a timeout. So really kind of the abstraction is saving the API team from having to manage these workers, right? And we could actually, you know, it, in another iteration, say when you put the queue, you could specify how many workers you want loaded, right? I want to run 5 workers, or I want to run 10 workers, et cetera. Um, and then we could kind of spin those up based on that. But for now, probably we'll just run 1 worker, and or maybe 2, um, and monitor that. But when the client API kind of dispatches or posts to the queue, it will dispatch the job, which will basically be this proxy worker process that will post that back to the client API. And then the rest of the commands are kind of management commands. So, um, you know, for whatever reason, there may be unprocessed jobs. So they could call that and say, let me find all the jobs that haven't been processed yet. Or there could be dead jobs. Um, or there could be unprocessed, or I might want to cancel an unprocessed job, right? So for whatever reason, I was supposed to send 5 of these things out, and the user doesn't want to send any more out. So let me cancel any jobs that haven't been processed. And then I could retry a dead job or cancel a dead job. And one of the questions that was brought up by Trip and Tyler was, why not make this more of a put just ID, like an update command. And the 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 only thing I was thinking is that this is really not an actual update. It's more of I want you to do an operation. So that's why I opted for kind of the REST operation semantics. Um, and I don't know if it's a standard in REST, but I have seen it out in the wild with Fire and CouchDB. So it is used to deal with operations that don't fit the CRUD process. And I actually use it to do like query commands and other operations.
I'm cool with it
Okay.
if everyone else is, but it's fine.
Cool.
So, a quick question, just so I understand
Yeah.
the flow. So I create a job. So say I'm using this queue service, it's wrapping like SQS.
Right.
Um, I go and create a queue in hyper63, and then which is probably just like a one-to-one with like a topic,
Right.
and then I create a job which gets dispatched to a worker in the hyper63 world, and that hyper63 worker will then post that job onto SQS.
It will post it to whatever you told it to post when you created your queue. So here it would post to api.engine.com.worker.
Okay. And then, so that thing is responsible for deciding how to handle so the worker will send a post with the job payload to that worker endpoint. That thing will do something with it and then respond back within 3 minutes to the worker.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
And so from the API client perspective, basically the client would, create an endpoint to kind of receive that worker, do the work, and then return back. So it's kind of weird. It's like the client's gonna post the job on Hyper just to get told to do the work at a later date. But so that seems really weird. But in a serverless world, that works really great because if the client API is using serverless, right, then this post can happen 10 times, 1,000 times, whatever, and their serverless API will spin up as much instances, as many processes to handle that.
Okay. So with my example, like this isn't really meant to be a wrapper around something like SQS, but actually a alternative to SQS is what it sounds like, where you aren't using a managed service like SQS, you just use hyper63, and then you would have your own set of workers that might just be lambdas in AWS.
Correct. And hyper63 could use SQS in the background, but you would have no access to SQS, right? It would just be behind the curtain.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not like the client's registering handlers for topics in SQS, and then we're just providing an API to put jobs on that queue. It's completely abstracted away.
Exactly.
Okay. Gotcha. I understand.
Yep.
And so if I wanted to, okay, so that sort of lends itself to the question I had earlier around like what the system of record is. So if I wanted to cancel an unprocessed job, uh, it would be hyper63's job to, not to overload the term job, it would be hyper63's responsibility to find that job on whatever the system of record is and get rid of it before a worker picks it up.
That's correct.
Okay. And once a worker's picked it up, it can't be canceled.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, unless it's in the dead job queue.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the main goals is that if you're using the queue service from hyper63, you really don't need to know how work queues work. You just need to um, create a topic queue on hyper63, post to that queue, and then wire up a lambda or a endpoint to handle the background jobs of that queue.
Yeah. It's cool. It's interesting. I mean, with this scenario, the client could decide what sort of schema they use for like job payloads.
Correct.
So I don't I don't I don't know why you would do this, but perhaps you have a use case for it where your job handler is like a GraphQL server. You could create jobs where the payload is a GraphQL mutation, and hyper63 would just post that to the endpoint that you provide when you created the queue, which would just be a GraphQL server.
Yep.
And that would be, so maybe the client really likes GraphQL. Maybe the client's me.
Yeah.
I really like GraphQL. So,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
okay.
There should not be a problem with that. And there's nothing, nothing saying that your endpoint has to be the client API, right? It could be Twilio, or it could be Mailgun, right? So you could just create your queue and say, here's the stuff you need to send to Mailgun. You might want to have something in between so that you put your formatters and things like that in a good direction. But or Zapier may be a good one to think about. Let's say you needed to send um, uh, send every time someone quote logged in and said, keep me informed. You would want to send a background process job to add their email to the newsletter.
Yeah. So you could just hook it into various third-party services directly if you wanted to, or you could just hook it into your own API where you could sprinkle your own business logic on top of that.
Exactly.
Have you given any thought to how this would uh, pun unintended, but hook into the hooks port?
Yeah. So currently the hooks port um, is kind of built in at the config level now. So you in your configuration you add hooks and you add your configuration for the hooks at that point. Um, we talked about scoping it up at higher level and have like a hooks CRUD interface. Um, and I think, yeah, other than it will be interesting to see when we have kind of both those pieces how they can interact. Um, but I haven't given it a lot of thought other than the fact that users of hyper63 could use this queue service to push messages in a Sentry, um, or some other service, mainly for tracing their APIs. And then, you know, I don't know, maybe there could be a flag where they say, you know what, for the data service, enable it for this monitoring queue. And so then all the events that are hooked in the data service would be passed to um, the particular queue that they gave the name of, Sentry or whatever. Does that make sense?
I think so.
I don't know. I would have to kind of see everything kind of out and play around with it for a while, but in theory, that could probably be done. And then you could have basically Hyper not only directing its events to some sort of monitoring um, bucket, but also the actual client APIs events through the same kind of pipeline.
So this would be a port on hyper63. I mean, the flow that you've described, I think it makes sense to me, and I think the devil's in the details. Like as we go to implement this, something might pop up and we're not taking into account. But right now, the flow makes sense to me. Would this be sort of the first case where hyper63 is having to sort of maintain some of its own state, like other than like config for other services and like connecting to other services that it's like via adapters? I think this is the first instance of that, unless I'm not understanding.
Yeah, I you know, there will be adapters. So there's BQ, which would be the first adapter that's basically a small node module that's wrapped around Redis. Um, and I think I can do it completely stateless, but as you said, you know, kind of the devil's in the details as it comes up. And the biggest question is the um, the loading of the worker processes, right? Um, so, but I think it can just be just like in a Docker compose where, you know, the worker process is pretty stateless. It just calls the queue service, gets all the registered queues, and then sets up all of its listeners, right? But I'll have to dig into it and see.
Okay. Well, like I said, on the surface level, I think I understand.
Cool. Casey, any questions from your side? Or thoughts?
Probably not any good ones. So originally, I guess my main question is less the flow of it. I think that kind of makes sense. More like who is using this? What's the use case for this specifically? If I'm using hyper63.
Yeah. So basically, one of my clients working with it's building a rules engine, and you can think of a web form out there that is asking for some information. Let's say, let's say that they're registering for an event, right? So a user is filling out this form, and based on what they fill in, the rules engine is going to assign them different presentations to go through. Let's say create kind of a Zoom schedule. But behind the scenes, this workshop or this event is working with partners, sponsors, and those sponsors want anyone that registers for one of their workshops in their Salesforce tool, right? But the client doesn't want to have the user that's filling out their entry information to have to wait for 5 or 6 round trips to Salesforce on that one submission. So what will happen is when they submit the form, it will run through the rules and assign them to the event, and then respond back to the user and says, hey, you're registered, here's your schedule. Thank you for choosing to attend this conference. And then behind the scenes, for each one of those sponsors, it will submit their contact information to each one of those sponsors' Salesforce buckets. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the queuing part is just so both you don't have to wait, but also so that you have an elegant way to check if something fails, not just a post into an abyss.
Correct. Exactly. So let's say you're wiring up Salesforce through something like Zapier or some other service, and for whatever reason, Salesforce isn't available for this client, or the other target's not available. They will be caught in the queue, but not lost. So then someone can resend them, so that the sponsors can have assuredness that that they're getting what they kind of purchased, right? They're getting the information that they purchased, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can you share the link inside the chat?
Sure. Sorry.
Thank you.
Janita, any thoughts from you?
No.
Yeah.
I have like very little understanding. I get the overall gist of what's going on.
Okay, cool. Trip, any thoughts?
No, I'm good. I trust you, Tom.
No, please. T Tear it up. But really the goal is if we can build a service where the client team doesn't have to know what SQS is and know what an Amazon key and secret is, or what Google is and what, you know, metadata is there, then basically all they have to do is know how to use JSON and know how to use HTTP and know how to use JWT or web tokens, that then they should be good to go. And that's kind of the goal. So they're getting a queue service with really not, you know, and it's the same thing with search, right? Not having to know how to spin up an Elasticsearch or cluster Elasticsearch, et cetera. This is just the same abstraction. Here's a queue service, but you don't have to manage this infrastructure. All you have to do is be able to make a REST call.
You have to be able to receive a REST call, or you
Yeah,
have to be able to make a REST call and then potentially receive a REST call. Or
that's correct.
assuming you're the handler and you're not just posting something directly to like a third party service.
That's correct. So you would need to know how to call an endpoint and also publish an endpoint
And validate what was published to you is legitimate.
and validate what's published to you. But that is
That pattern can be covered with the salve of documentation and resources. This is how you build a webhook.
Or maybe build it into the Cloud Call client, like that validation.
yeah, and that's a good segue on the client. So looking at some other similar services, and you know, one service in particular basically came up and said, you know what, we're deprecating our client. Here's our REST API and just use it. And I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. I mean, I created a client and it's very opinionated in terms of functional programming, but you know, I could see both sides, right? It's kind of nice to have a client, but do you support and maintain clients in every single language? Or do you kind of make the stance of saying, you know what, build your own clients, we'll publish them in our third party kind of area? What do you think?
It's a really good question. I think because maintaining those clients can be just a big chunk of work for what, if you built the REST API correctly, it's just like a bunch of REST calls. I mean, I do think there will be some really common patterns that emerge out of how users consume the different ports. Like, I would send some data, I also want to cache it, and I also want to index it.
Right.
And that seems like such a common pattern that I think folks might want to have something that they can just plug and play.
Yep.
And there's like a bunch of utilities that users like just create in the open source domain, and I'm thinking, I don't know, you have like a store, search, and cache, like sort of utility, and then you can compose that with a bunch of other utilities, and you kind of build your own client. But they'd be sort of like not fully featured. They'd be like, it'd be one specific thing, and then like think, and then somehow you could compose them together. I don't know. I'm like spitballing here, but
Yeah, it's cool. It's a cool concept.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I think the trick with the client is how, where do you draw the line of magic, right?
I think we could have, maybe we could have some sort of instead of building a client, we build one of those plug and play things, and it implements an API, and then just say, hey, if you want to do this sort of thing, like just implement this API, and then use a tool like Ramda to compose them all together, or like, and then all we have to maintain is that API, and then just implement that, and then you can, and then there's a whole community that can build those similar to adapters, and then just tell people how to compose them to build their own sort of clients. I'm doing air quotes.
Yep. No, I like it. My mind immediately jumps to like a wizard screen where you can check the boxes that you want and say generate client, and it
Yeah,
composes them for you.
yeah, it'd be very similar to kind of like how like Webpack plugins work.
Yep. That sounds cool.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess it'd be very similar to how our adapters work as well. Because when I was putting together the pattern for how to compose adapters, like the first place I looked was like how Rollup does it, and that's where I got the idea for sort of the life cycle for the adapters, or the plugins, I should call them. And so I figured building a client would work in a very similar way, and it would prevent us from having to maintain our own client in a bunch of different languages. Instead, just introduce a pattern and an API, and then just leave it to the community to implement it, and then have a simple utility to compose them all together.
Like it.
Sorry, I digressed. But I sympathize with the idea of not maintaining a client, but I do think there will be some common patterns that emerge that if we had something that allowed users to just leverage that pattern without a whole lot of lifting, I think that would help with adoption.
I broke it.
All right.
I broke the arm and that.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
I didn't mean to. The ball was bouncing it and got on the coffee table.
Cool. All right. Well, is there anything else? Thanks for the awesome discussion and all the great questions. Feel free to go into that document and play devil's advocate and blow it up. But I really appreciate all the thought through this. I don't know. I think it might be a cool service. I do know it'll help this one client to ship their product. So that'll be good.
Yeah, it sounds like a cool idea to me.
Yeah, I like the abstraction. I've got to run. I've got another meeting to hit pretty soon.
Okay, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Have
Thanks,
a great
everyone.
afternoon. See ya.
You too,
See
Tom.
ya.
Thanks.
Yep.